to the Workforce Wire podcast, brought to you by Employ Prince George's, bridging the gap between job seekers and businesses. And now, here's your host, Walter Simmons.
Welcome to the Workforce Wire, brought to you by Employ Prince George's. I'm Walter Simmons, your host, and today I'm very excited, more excited than my normal excited, because we have Tiffany Harvey, the Prince George's County Legislative Director, working in the Office of the County Executive. Welcome to the Workforce Wire.
Oh, thank you, Walter. I'm quite excited to be here with you all today in this beautiful building, this wonderful team of folks, to talk about some of the wonderful things that we were doing in Prince George's County.
Great. So, workforce board directors across the country are always scared about the balance between policy development, lobbying, advocating. But, you know, one of the things that we are strong in Prince George's County is communicating with our elected officials and legislative directors like Ms. Harvey to ensure that we are moving our workforce system forward. So this show is going to really talk about some of what things we're doing in Maryland, but also things that local workforce development board professionals and directors can do in their local area. So, Tiffany, can you tell us a little more about your role as the legislative director and what your department does?
Sure. I joined the county executives team in December of 2018. Prior to that, I was in the Office of the Attorney General for the state of Maryland, serving in a similar capacity, doing legislative affairs work. And before that, I was a litigator, so doing both sides of the table in courtrooms. And since then, I've shifted my focus primarily to lobbying for government agencies. So the work that we do for the Office of the County Executive is my team and I. We essentially advance her agenda before the local elected bodies, to include the county council, as well as the state delegation of the member of the General Assembly.
Okay. So how do you get, this is a workforce show. So as we bring guests on who are subject matter experts in their field, we want to know about what you do, but we always have to ask the same question. What led you down this career path into your current role, so that if there's a listener out there who says they want to be a future legislative director, what can they learn from your experience and your journey to become a big time county legislative director, burning the pathways in Maryland?
I think first and foremost, the advice that I would give is to kind of just be nimble and don't have a structured thought about what your career is supposed to look like. My career is largely kind of shifted based on opportunities that have come up. And one of the things that I have enjoyed the most about the transition from moving out of the courtroom and moving into a lobbying capacity is the ability to no longer help just kind of one person or one family at a time, but to help people and like hundreds/thousands of people at a time when you're moving and advancing policy. That's just kind of something magical that is a special opportunity, and I really enjoy being able to do that, because when something goes live and it becomes effective law, then you kind of see it permeate the community, and it's kind of cool to watch that happen.
So keyword there to everybody, be nimble. I think that is something that when workforce professionals and American Job Centers are providing career readiness classes, we don't highlight that enough. Too many people tell us, well, we want to do this and we want to do that, or they say, pick your major now. But really in life, everything changes. And you have to be ready to change your career and not be afraid to go down a different path. So thank you for that advice for our listeners out there. One thing that we really focus on, millennials being the second greatest population working today. And then we have our Generation Z populations following. Many of these demographics, many of these youth and young adults don't focus on local and state elections and politics. Really, a lot of them run from it. Can you tell those listeners why they should pay attention to their local and state elections and politics? I told somebody today, elections have consequences. But why should these millennials and Generation Zers, I guess, why should they pay attention to local and state elections and politics?
I think your point is exactly right. Elections have consequences, and particularly when you're talking about state and local elections, they're going to affect you more than who's ever sitting down in Pennsylvania Avenue and what the policies that are kind of being constructed and crafted on the federal level. Because you're talking about the daily impacts of your life and the policies that are rolling out that are going to touch you from who's ever been elected as the sheriff, to who's ever been elected as the state's attorney, and how they prosecute crimes in your community. When you're talking about the county executive, the policies that are rolling out of their offices, those are the policies which people are going to live with every single day. And so for those reasons, I think it's important for everybody, not just Gen Xers and millennials and Gen Z folks, but everybody should be paying attention, because those are the elections that really affect our day-to-day interactions with our community.
I agree. I think, we talk about this all the time. I talk with my colleagues from the Maryland Workforce Association of Maryland, of all of our workforce board directors, on what policies could affect our two customers. Workforce systems have customers, two general customers, job seekers and businesses. If we aren't paying attention to what policies are being passed or proposed, we can't help prepare our our businesses. One of the big things affecting Maryland is the minimum wage law. As a workforce professional, we have to represent our low wage workers who want increases, but also we have to really think about we could have businesses that can't afford a higher wage that are coming to us and talking about having to lay off people or losing productivity in their business. So workforce professionals, if you're listening, please make sure you pay attention to local policy, state policy, and provide that information as a service to your job seekers and businesses. If you want more information about what we're doing in Prince George's County, please visit us online at www.employpg.org or find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at EmployPG. We can really provide you information on what's going on in Maryland, what's going on in the DC metropolitan area. Again, that's www.employpg.org. You got something, Tiffany?
I just wanted to say this year was a great example of kind of what you're talking about. On the state legislative level, we had one of our local delegates, Delegate Diana Fennell, who was super active and involved in the Fight for 15 down in Annapolis. The county executive was down there testifying in support of that bill, and we were able to pass that.
Fight for 15, tell our listeners if they don't know.
So essentially the Fight for 15 is, you mentioned the minimum wage for employers across the state of Maryland. And it's pushing and advancing the minimum wage up to 15. I can't recall what year it is. I think it's by 2022.
2021, something like that.
But anyway, so in the next couple of years, Maryland will be kind of moving forward. And for low income and just workers in general, those are the things that, again, are going to, that affects how you feed your children, how you get your kids to school, from school every day. Those are direct impacts to how people live their lives on a daily basis. And again, that's done on the local level, right? And so if you're not paying attention to who's driving the ship for Prince George's County, then you might miss out on a chance to have your interests impacted and your voice heard on that level. It's also important from the perspective of paying attention to what's going on kind of in the General Assembly and as well at the county council level as well, because you can testify. You can show up, you can deliver written testimony, you can actually have your voice heard, and they'll listen to you. You only get about 2 minutes to 3 minutes. But
and they will hit that timer on you very quickly.
But it's an opportunity kind of like no other to be heard by the folks that are actually going to be pulling the trigger and making decisions about how we handle business in the state of Maryland.
And the Fight for 15 is really important on multiple avenues when you talk about the Prince George's County economy and any local economy where you border other major economies. In Prince George's County, 73% of all of our workers work outside of our county, which can affect the amount of restaurants that we have in our county that say we don't have enough lunch crowd to have a large scale restaurant. But it also affects where they grocery shop, the revenue generated in the county, because when you get off work, you want to go to the grocery store around the corner and then head home. You don't want to drive 45 minutes, then go to the grocery store, then drive another 45 minutes. So us increasing our wages could potentially, bring some of our workers back home, which is a positive that a lot of people don't bring up and they talk about. Okay, so staying on this topic, can you give our listeners an overview of the Maryland General Assembly and the legislative session and when the legislative session happens?
Okay. So I'll start with when the legislative session happens. So the session begins in January and it runs for 90 days. And so it concludes second Tuesday in April. It is a fast and furious race for those 90 days. It's the time that Maryland's political body moves pieces of legislation forward, which then become laws, and they're passed and become effective at whatever date the General Assembly determines to be necessary for that piece of legislation. The way it's kind of broken down, there's two chambers that exist. There's the House of Delegates and there's the Senate. And so all of the legislative districts, they have 3 delegates and 1 senator. And the Senate essentially, both parties do similar functions, right? They both have standing committees, and those standing committees hear each piece of legislation that's dropped before, and then the pieces of legislation kind of move through the chambers and get to the other side. And the goal is for your piece of legislation to make it successfully over to the other chamber and back before sine die, which is when the bell kind of rings on the last day of session, which is why it's such a difficult time of year, because there's a lot of things that can happen to a bill to derail it or change it. And so, it's essentially watching every moment and paying attention to the pieces of legislation that are important to your cause.
So you're like County Executive Alsobrooks' chief negotiator in policy, basically. That's what you're telling us.
I mean, my job is to help get her agenda through the General Assembly. So however you want to describe that. There's a whole team of us that kind of are down there. It includes her chief of staff, her chief administrative officer, all of the cabinet heads, or agency heads, directors who have pieces of important legislation that are coming through there. You've been down there before to testify on bills. And so our job is essentially to help manage that process for folks, get them where they need to be, make sure we've effectively lobbied the senators or the members of the House that are going to be hearing and considering that piece of legislation.
So, when you look at, 2024 election, the way that Tiffany just ran from that answer will show you that you should really look for her name on a ballot near you. So 2024, vote Harvey. So getting back to that, but no, that really helps people understand is that it has to go through, there's 2 houses. It has to go from get passed in one house, go to the next house, get passed, and then come back. And then the governor has to sign it as well, right?
So the governor doesn't have to sign it.
Okay.
He just can't veto it.
Okay.
If he vetoes it, then you have to have an override, and there's a whole process that engages for that. But your bill does not have to be signed to become active legislation. If he doesn't sign it, then it'll still become effective legislation.
So if we have a listener right now that is trying to understand this Maryland legislative process, can they go somewhere online to learn about this, or how can they get educated?
Absolutely. So the Maryland Department of General Services is a fantastic resource that's manned by the state, and they have essentially like a legislative lingo document that they have out there. They walk you through the process from conception of the piece of legislation all the way through. It walks you through the process of the votes that are required and the procedural hurdles that the bills are going to face as they kind of negotiate through the chambers. It's a super helpful resource. But they also have their elected officials. So folks can go on to that website as well. They can go on to the State Board of Elections website. They can find out who their local elected officials are, and they can work with their offices if there's a piece of legislation or if they have an idea for like workforce development or something of that sort. They can work with their legislators now to kind of start drafting those and getting those ideas ready and crafted for the 2020 session.
All right. January 1st, 2020. Get ready. I would say this, in our internal youth program, Knowledge Equals Youth Success, we talked about that frequently on the show. We talked to our young adults about the voting process. We actually talked about their elected officials. We use that as a part of their career readiness. I would advise every single workforce professional, every single local area to include that to your local youth curriculum to educate and empower our young adults to be involved and be active because it affects their paychecks. It affects their tax bracket. It'll allow them to understand what it's like to be an adult. Again, if you want more information about our youth program, Knowledge Equals Youth Success, visit employpg.org or PGC Keys, again, PGC Keys, Keys, on our social media. So talking about the Maryland legislative session in 2019, tell our home listeners, Prince George's County residents, Prince George's County businesses, what happened in the 2019 legislative session that's going to affect home?
Oh, there was a tremendous amount of legislation that moved that will affect the home, as you called it. The county executive had a fantastic first showing in the General Assembly as county executive. She moved several pieces of key legislation that you all will see directly kind of in your day-to-day happenings around the county. There was kind of 3 areas that were her areas that were the most important for her. The first that moved had to do with youth development. And so one of her visionary pieces is kind of finding ways to get our youth more engaged and to do character development through many different vehicles. One of them that we looked at this year was through sports, right? And so a piece of legislation that passed will make it easier for park and planning to start working to handle sports and youth development programming that's coming through their lens, and more to come on that as we move forward through the rest of our administration.
Okay.
So the next piece had to do with county beautification. So some legislation passed that will allow the county to handle fines for illegal dumping differently. So we've got a new classification for bulk items that have been dumped on the side of the road or otherwise abandoned in the county. So there's now a penalty process that can be rolled out that allows local law enforcement to actually issue citations. Previously, it required weights and measuring tools that officers don't generally have on them. So now, if folks are leaving what we saw evidence of, which is couches, boats, furniture, stoves, things like that, let's stop doing it. Let's make the county a little bit prettier. And so the goal towards that is the whole idea of Prince George's pride and just building more pride in the community that we live in the community that we're growing and raising our families in, et cetera. And so that's something that's really important to Ms. Also Brooks, is just having everybody collectively feel the same about, the county they call home.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think one of the key for a workforce professional, and especially a workforce board director, a key to their success is being able to understand and learn about these local policies, about the priorities of their elected officials, and include that in their workforce programs. One, to generate support, two, to generate funding, but also to ensure that your local workforce system aligns with your local government. One of the things that we saw in Prince George's County this year with the Stop It, Don't Drop It campaign and Prince George is Proud, with the focus on our communities and neighborhood beautification, is we're really talking with our redevelopment authority and our reentry program on building a program for returning citizens that can build parks. We also have a lot of food deserts in the county, so they're working with Farming for Hunger, one of our local partners, to build raised plant beds in these parks. So by the time these returning citizens graduate out of the program, they've, one, learned about agriculture, two, they learn about construction and landscaping, and we're hoping that that can transition them into a career in one of those industries, all in-demand industries in Prince George's County. So workforce board directors, this is another avenue, policy and legislation, that can drive how you create workforce programs in your local area. Please use this as a tip when you're developing or trying to come up with new ideas for workforce programs to engage target populations. I commonly hassle and talk to Tiffany. She commonly doesn't always return my phone calls. But the good news is I just keep calling. So you have to do that sometimes as well, because Tiffany, her team is very busy, especially during the 90-day session. A lot of workforce people, sometimes we say, they don't want to talk to us. You just have to understand that everybody's priority isn't your priority. Everybody's time isn't your time. So you have to stay consistent. And I'm very happy to have you on our show and be a partner of Employ Prince George's. Let's also talk about education and workforce development. In Maryland, we cannot talk about legislation, workforce, and education and not bring up the Kirwan Commission. Can you explain what this is? Workforce board directors across the state are confused. Residents are confused. I think some of our elected officials are confused. Can you just give us an overview of what the Kirwan Commission is, what it means to education and workforce development in Maryland?
So the Kirwan Commission was a commission that was put together at the request of the governor to essentially help advance Maryland's education to world-class caliber education systems, right? And so their goal was to make some recommendations about how we can move Maryland forward in our public schools, so that we are making sure that our children get the best educations possible when they're matriculating through primary and secondary education. And so some recommendations were previously made. The final report is still pending, right? Because there's some formulas that
you got to fund
tricky,
it, yeah.
Right? And so last year, during the 2019 legislation, there was a lot of conversation kind of around how are we going to fund all of these things? Because it's going to cost some money to essentially redo the entire model of education that we've been accustomed to in the state of Maryland for some time. And so there's a lot of creative opportunities and things that are being considered right now to try to fund the requirements, because it is going to be a costly process, right? So during the 2019 session, they passed something called the Blueprint for Maryland's Education, which is essentially like a precursor to what they expect to come in 2020. And so The state is working very hard. Your elected officials are working very hard right now to come up with funding formulas that are realistic benchmarks that the state can meet, but as well as the matches that are going to have to come from the county, right? And so each of the counties in the city and the state have some form of matching or state aid that comes from them, right? So some, depending on the wealth of the county, the match levels are a little bit higher than they might be in other places. And so the challenge is it's going to cost something for the counties and the city to participate in this program. And so just figuring out how to do that and how to fund the program, I think will be the biggest challenge that we see kind of on the horizon as we get ready for 2020.
But if we do figure it out, it could potentially mean a lot of increased resources, funding, buildings.
Oh, it's going to be...
For education?
It's a holistic change, right? The idea is to put a new priority on how we have looked at our education and our educators, right? And so the models that the current commission is looking at pay teachers at a much higher rate, a significantly higher rate than we do in Maryland, but also across the country, right? And so one of the things that we saw in the rollout from the blueprint, the bill that passed in 2019, was teacher raises coming out of that, right? And so the goal is to attract fantastic and phenomenal teachers to the profession and to retain them, right? And that's the hard part, is when you're doing important work like educating our youth and the next generation, if we're not giving you the resources to be successful, it's really hard to keep good folks in those fields, right?
And that's a key point there. This is what I talk about when you're knowing your regional economies as a workforce professional. Prince George's County borders the District of Columbia. District of Columbia has a high cost of living, which means they have high wages, and compared to Prince George's County that has a lower cost of living. This is why a lot of our residents travel across state lines to go work in the district. But if we don't have a competitive wage, if we don't have qualified teachers in our schools, we can't keep the top talent, which means we can't ensure that we're preparing our next generation. So the current commission is really could possibly make major changes to our education system. One of the big things for my local workforce board directors to pay attention to, and why Employ Prince George's has looked at this, is college and career. Focus on careers. There's the average salary of our local painters union is $55,000 with a high school diploma, and you can get into our unions without a high school diploma even. So there's a lot of verbiage in the Kerwin language, and a lot of elected officials are talking about workforce board, youth providers or in-school youth counselors being involved in the high schools and really assisting to prepare these young adults for careers, so that when they walk across the stage, like our Councilmember Harrison always talks about Henrico County, Virginia, where they do a signing day for people going into the trades. We want to see as many of these young adults who aren't going to college walk across the stage with an offer for employment and have a career. So I think that's one thing that our local directors should look for out of this. Tiffany, is there anything else that you think our listeners in Prince George's County should know about what passed in 2019 in the legislative session?
Yeah, so there was a bill that was kind of a huge win for us, and it was something unlike anything that passed across the rest of the state. You might have heard that there was a push towards, in addition to the Kerwin piece, right, which is essentially the operating, but also the capital side of education, which is the funding of building schools. Building schools, right?
There you go.
Huge deal, and kind of the larger bill, the all-encompassing state bill, kind of died towards the end of session, but Prince George's County was able to get a win in a really innovative bill that came out, which was Senate Bill 1011, and it allowed for a P3 model to be used in the construction of school projects. So the bill passed, and it allows the creation of kind of a funding mechanism that will allow us to use these public-private partnerships to help build and finance these schools, which is a tremendous opportunity for the county to backfill. We've got, Prince George's County has the second oldest schools in the state of Maryland.
And overcrowding.
And overcrowding in parts of the county, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other parts of the county, there's schools that are falling apart. And it's hard to build pride in education when kids are going to an environment that's not reflective of what we think is their best, right? And so, anytime you're asked to do a job, when you are given resources to include a facility that matches the expectation of what the output is, then people perform better, right? And so the same is true in education. If we give kids something that's less than their best, then we can't ask them to perform at the level that we want them to. And so putting a high priority on the capital side of this and giving our kids great resources in the classrooms, and they're being competitive against other counties and against kids all around the world, right? We want our kids to be at the forefront of that. And so this bill kind of starts the process for that. And hopefully, as we move towards the 2020 General Assembly session, there'll be some funds released kind of from the state level that'll help us fund our project. And not just in Prince George's County, but across the state, we can see a real commitment to that piece of this as well.
So on the P3 model, is that public-private partnership? Mm-hmm. Just can you give us a brief explanation on what that, in general, what it means?
So the goal of the P3 partnership is to alleviate some of the challenges that currently exist, right? By making the process more user-friendly for kind of the private world, meaning it will allow schools to be built faster. They'll be able to deliver us the actual school. Under the model that we were able to pass in 2019, the private partner will manage the school, which is a huge deal because, as you I'm sure are familiar with, in public schools, one of the biggest challenges is maintenance, right?
That's any government building. Every person who works in the government building can complain about maintenance. Everybody can tell you that.
Right. So maintenance is a problem. And so the model that we have in place shifts that, and the burden goes over to the private partner to maintain the school. And then after, there'll be an MOU, which essentially sets forth the terms of engagement between the parties, right? The private partner will then return the school back, and Prince George's County will maintain ownership of the school the entire time, but the maintenance, et cetera, will then be returned to the county. And at the time that it's returned, the school has to be in a particular state, right? So you're not going to get a school back that has a failing HVAC unit. And in 10 years, we're not going to be coming back to the General Assembly saying, hey, we need more money for X, Y, and Z, right? So it's a smarter way to build and maintain schools. And I think Prince George's County is a great place to start because it's a growing county, right? Just the opportunity to use that here, I think it's a really special place to start that program.
And it's a mechanism for economic growth. Again, when we talk about the customers of a workforce board, the business is your customer. If a business doesn't have contracts, doesn't have opportunities, they can't hire employees. We will use this information in Prince George's County and on our workforce board to inform our businesses on our board and the businesses that are working in our job centers that are in one of the largest industries in the county and the region, construction, and let them know of these opportunities, because that could correlate into them saying, hey, Walter, we did get the contract to build a school and I need to hire 150 laborers. If a workforce board and system helps a business to educate them about a contract opportunity, a revenue generating opportunity, they're almost guaranteed to come back to you when they need to get laborers to fill those jobs, because they see you as a resource. They see you as an ally in their growth. We've seen this across the board with some of our largest employers and our board members. So workforce board directors, realize that helping your businesses with contracts and growth helps you fill your placement goals and your performance, but you really have to focus on different avenues where you can be a benefit to your business. Always ask yourself, when you want a person to partner with you, ask yourself, what is the return on the investment for them to partner with you? What are you giving them, not just what you want from them? So keep that in mind. Tiffany, we're going to close out our episode today. We normally close it out by saying, what can our listeners across the country use in their local areas? And so I have, one key or two key questions. The same topic is you've learned a little bit about workforce board professionals and what I do over the last 7 months. There's a workforce board professional in every state and multiple professionals in each state. How can we work effectively with your colleagues across the country? What do you see as a benefit or an avenue for a workforce board to provide you a return on investment so that you can answer their phone calls?
I think the key part is communication, right? And making sure that we understand what your workforce needs, and so that we can then find a way to overlay that with the priorities of the county executive's office or whatever office, your workforce are working with, right?
Yep.
And I think knowing what the community needs is a huge priority for us, right? Because then we can make sure that we're weighing in on bills that are important to Prince George's County residents or other,
stakeholders, businesses, job seekers.
So, for example, like HB 1266 passed, right, which is going to give us an opportunity to access a level of grant monies that will help reduce blight in the county, right?
Yep.
And it will bring economic development into Prince George's County, into neighborhoods that are severely in need of it, right?
Jobs.
So, jobs.
There you go.
Those are things that are important. And so, when you have good relationships, kind of like you and I touched base multiple times during the session, we can talk about bills that are coming that I might need you to go testify on, right? Or you might need me to know so I can submit testimony, whether it's written or be at the table for those things, right? The season that we're in right now is the time for bills to kind of, we start developing what those legislative policies are looking like. As we're having conversations and preparing, knowing what your folks need is really helpful because it informs our process back on the other end, right?
Yep.
And it helps the county executive kind of narrow and shape what she wants to do to be responsive to economic development and workforce development to the citizens that she represents every day.
So, workforce professionals, I'm going to leave you with this. You have to communicate the needs of your stakeholders, the needs of your customers, job seekers and businesses, and your partners, educational institutions, because you're supposed to be the policy driver in your local area. This isn't lobbying. This is explaining to your elected officials, your legislative directors, on the needs of your stakeholders that is going to allow them to be successful and drive your economy forward. That will allow Tiffany Harvey, our legislative directors, our elected officials, to then craft their own policies to drive the increased economy, their local economies, and then they can lobby. And I think we have to really understand what is the difference between advocating and informing our elected officials and our government officials versus lobbying. I think if you can educate them on what they need to know to ensure their economy is successful, they will do the lobbying off of themselves. And that is a really fine line that we don't cross over, but we also need to understand what is the difference. So make sure you educate and inform your government officials and your elected officials to make sure that they are doing the things that are going to benefit your local economy and your local workforce system. Tiffany, thank you for coming on our show. We hope to have you back. We want to talk about P3. We want to talk about tax incentives. There's a whole host of things we can talk about, so we hope we can have you back on our show later on. And specifically, in March, we are going to talk about celebrating Women's Month. Tiffany is a young leader. She's advancing. I really want to have you back on so you can talk to other future lawyers and especially women of color who are looking at the law field and say, I don't see many people like me, so that you can tell a little bit more about your story and empower some of our future lawyers and elected officials to let them know how they can, eventually be a big shot legislative director for one of the largest counties and move forward. But I think you really are a role model to a lot of people. And I want to thank you for that and thank you for being on our show.
That has been truly a pleasure. I'd love to come and talk with your folks some more and talk to you some more and call you back in the meantime.
There you go. All right. That's it for the Workforce Wire, brought to you by Employ Prince George's. Find us online at www.employpg.org. Thank you.